Welcome to Let's Talk Poverty, the podcast that helps you understand poverty in Calgary through the lens of enough for all. It tackles the stigma surrounding poverty, challenging biases and assumptions. From the voices of lived experience to community members to highlighting raw data, we speak with subject matter and policy experts, community leaders, and you to explore the root causes of poverty in our city and how we can come together to make changes that matter. Let's Talk Poverty is recorded in Treaty 7, the lands of the Blackfoot Nations, the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. We also acknowledge the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda First Nations and the Otipemisiwak Métis Government Districts 5 and 6. Welcome to Let's Talk Poverty. I'm Michelle James, and today I'm joined by Dr. Andrew McGee and Courtney Moe. Andrew McGee is a professor of economics at the University of Alberta, a labor economist. Professor McGee's research includes studies of gig work, job search, gender gaps, and the role of personality in the labor market. Professor McGee received his PhD in economics from the Ohio State University and was previously on the faculty of Simon Fraser University. Courtney is the Director of Community Impact at Momentum, a Calgary-based social enterprise. Courtney has worked in public policy research and advocacy on poverty reduction for more than 10 years. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Nice to be here.
So we're here today to talk about Alberta's gig economy. The Social Policy Collaborative recently published The State of Gig Work in Alberta, Trends, Challenges, and Solutions. This report sheds light on the pressures facing Alberta's gig workers and the policy tools that could better support them. So Andrew, I'll start with you. When we talk about the gig economy, what types of work are we talking about?
Gig work generally refers to work that's being performed on demand, usually on a per task basis by individuals, freelancers, who are in many cases being connected to customers by platforms. So, I mean, in the past, a classic example of gig work would be babysitting, right? Where your freelance babysitter performs a job for a family, those are the customers. But today, a lot of that work is mediated through digital platforms. So like in the rideshare and delivery sectors, you have Uber and Lyft and Skip the Dishes, connecting the freelancers to the customers themselves. So what's different about it relative to a lot of other jobs is that you don't have the employer-employee relationship and the security that entails.
And who is doing gig work in Alberta?
Well, that's an interesting question. About 6% of Albertans appear to be participating in gig work. In terms of who is it? Well, we know that older workers, so workers over 50, participate in gig work at higher rates than other workers. And similarly, we know that women participate in gig work at a slightly higher rate than men.
Yeah, very fascinating. That came out of the research. Speaking of the research, Courtney, this emerged as a priority of the Social Policy Collaborative. Can you maybe walk us through what initially motivated the group to study the gig economy? What were you seeing and hearing at Momentum that led to this project?
Yes. The Social Policy Collaborative is a group of community organizations committed to working together to inform the development of public policy that improves economic and social well-being of Albertans. So we aim to bring a clear and collective voice to policymakers and to address the most pressing challenges faced by vulnerable Albertans. Many of our organizations are working to support people living in poverty, living on a low income, those seeking access to education and training, and basic needs. And at Momentum, we meet gig workers across our programs. So we partner with people living on a low income to go from surviving to thriving, from getting by to getting ahead. And we do that through self-employment training, skills training, and financial empowerment programs. And we see gig workers across all of those programs. So take, for example, Wasim, who recently joined one of our trades training programs and is now on a pathway to a great career in the trades. But that is after a long, rough start upon arriving in Canada from Tunisia. He wasn't able to find work in his field of training, and unpaid bills started piling up. So, out of necessity, he turned to gig work. And so for 4 years, he relied on delivery and passenger driving platform work to survive, sometimes working or often working 12-hour days. He logged over 5,000 rides, braving dangerous road conditions, all without benefits or job security or recourse when the driving platform abruptly closed his account. So he was left confused. His complaints and calls went unanswered. He had great ratings, but no explanation of why all of a sudden this vital income he was cut off from. And so we've heard from gig workers, many gig workers in our programs about some of the issues and opportunities that they see in gig economy.
Thanks for sharing that story, Courtney. I think it highlights a lot of gaps in our understanding as we set out on this project. Andrew, as we talked to you early on in this kind of learning and discovery from kind of the client groups that SPC was working with, were you aware of any gaps in the research that you were hoping to fill with this project?
Well, I think research on gig work is still in a developing field. The major challenge of the field is how do you identify gig workers in both tax records and surveys? In tax records, it's particularly challenging because in Canada, at least, we don't have any tax forms that clearly identify gig workers. And indeed, it's quite possible that a lot of gig income isn't being reported on tax returns. And similarly, in surveys, most of the important Canadian surveys, like the labor force survey that we used extensively, don't explicitly ask about who is a gig worker every month. And so there isn't a ton of great evidence on the state of the gig economy and gig workers in Canada. There's a very good study by some people at Statistics Canada that was published in 2021, but that study only um, investigated the gig economy up through 2016. A lot of what we were doing in this report was just trying to establish some basic facts about the gig economy up through 2023, 24. And in addition, we don't know too much about the earnings and hours of gig workers. And so I was very interested in learning about sort of what are the approximate hourly wages of workers in gig work and that kind of thing.
Hmm. That's really interesting about the demographic kind of challenges that we really didn't know who was working gig work in this province or in the city. Courtney, from working directly with workers engaged in the gig economy at Momentum, would you see what you're seeing on the front lines reflected in the demographic data on who is working gig work that we published in this report?
Well, I was surprised to learn that a high proportion of gig workers are women, and especially women with children. I understand it can be because of flexibility that gig work offers, allowing, to increase a modest income while maintaining caregiving responsibilities. And I was at a fast food chain late one night recently, and I noticed a delivery driver come in, and as she was leaving, so was I. And I could see that she had kids in the car. And I mean, there are so many issues and opportunities in this scenario, and I know nothing of this family circumstance, but what we hear in community is that gig work is born out of necessity for those who are struggling to afford basic needs, and that many workers end up in scenarios that feel undesirable, unsafe, and unsustainable, but they have no other choice. So I guess the other demographic that I might describe as a demographic is workers who have no other choice. Like their credentials aren't recognized. They don't have Canadian work experience, or they can't find a job in their field of training, or they're working, but life is just so unaffordable, even with the job that they do have. So take Priska, for example, another participant in one of our programs. She's a worker in the gig economy providing cleaning services for various apps. And despite having a background in finance and accounting, she hasn't been able to re-credential in her field since arriving in Canada. And when her marriage ended, she ended up in shelter, and she turned to gig work just so she and her family could find a place to live, so they could move out. Um, but she worries about her safety in the long run. She's sometimes put in unsafe conditions, such as situations with like large pests or mold infestations. And she doesn't have access to employment insurance, Canada pension plan, or workers' compensation. She worries about her ability to retire. Um, and right now she could really use a car, but her gig work doesn't qualify her for a car loan. And so, all that to say, I was both surprised by some of the learnings that we had around demographic data, but we do see and hear those stories as what's been reflected in this research report.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Courtney. I feel like that story really highlights some of the challenges that are inherent in gig work, and certainly some of the challenges that we highlighted through our report. Maybe Andrew, it might be a good opportunity from the research that you did. Could you maybe elaborate on some of the challenges that really came through the research in relation to gig work?
Yeah, so I think Courtney's already hit on a few of them that gig workers, because they're not in traditional employment relationships, are not covered by a lot of social insurance mechanisms. So, for instance, they're not paying into the EI system, the employment insurance system, which includes both, unemployment benefits, but also parental leave benefits, sick leave benefits, et cetera. And they're also not receiving any of those benefits that are offered by employers, supplemental health insurance being amongst the important ones. So, I mean, the lack of insurance mechanisms that they face, or that they, excuse me, that they enjoy, leave them particularly vulnerable to all kinds of shocks. And the other thing that we found, which I think is quite distressing, is that the implied hourly wages of gig workers, about 28% of them are below the lowest statutory minimum wages in Canada, which suggests that, yeah, more than a quarter of gig workers are working for less than minimum wage.
Really challenging. I think when we talk about poverty, we can definitely talk about low wages as a huge contributor to that problem. Um, we spoke to the challenges of gig work. I wonder, Andrew, if you saw any opportunities in the gig economy for the ability to influence workers' ability to either avoid poverty or achieve economic stability.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I think that it's true that gig work is a mixed bag. That for a lot of gig workers, it's offering them the kind of flexibility that they do benefit from it. As Courtney was saying, there's a big difference between men and women engaged in gig work. Women in Alberta in gig work, about 30% of them worked in a traditional job compared to only 14% of men, meaning that they're supplementing, many of them, their paid employment relationships with gig work. And a lot of that's because women in Canada, as in other countries, are much more likely to be working part-time and not necessarily part-time by choice. So half of the gig workers in Alberta in our sample were working part-time on their main job compared to only 26% of men. Likewise, 35% of the women in gig work were working multiple jobs compared to only 18% of men. So essentially twice as likely to be part-time, working multiple jobs, and being in paid employment. So for many of these women, it's pretty clear that gig work is offering them the opportunity to sort of top up their hours worked in a flexible manner. So, I mean, just because gig work is in some cases low, it's a low paid job, doesn't mean the individuals engaging in it are worse off because of it, right? In the absence of gig work, they wouldn't have these options. So, I mean, for sure, I think there are pros and cons of gig work for workers.
Yeah, Courtney, are you seeing any of those trends at Momentum?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Andrew described it really well. Mixed bag, I think, is what he said. Yeah, there's the good, there's the flexibility, the low barrier to entry. It helps people get by. And, it's a lifeline, but it rarely provides living wages, sometimes not minimum wages, and few benefits, few protections, and this precariousness. You don't know if you're going to get a customer that night. And you can get removed from a platform without fair or transparent process. And so we see it preventing people from getting ahead in some scenarios because any free time you might have or additional time you might have instead of attending education or training or working on language development or networking, the things that we can do to advance and grow our incomes is instead spent in on low wage work. And yet we recognize that it is a lifeline. And so We want to amplify the benefits and reduce the issues and problems with gig work is our hope and goal for this project.
Well, that is a fabulous segue to my next question. Thank you, Courtney. From both of your perspectives, maybe we can start with Courtney and then I'll ask you, Andrew, the same. What is the most pressing change that the gig economy needs to better benefit workers?
What we hear from workers is we need minimum wage protections so that engaged time on work counts as work. And so that wages actually will cover fuel, car insurance, maintenance, the actual costs of doing that work. We hear from workers that dispute resolution is really important so that workers don't lose a critical source of income over one customer complaint or not even knowing necessarily why they lost access to that gig work. We hear that workers want better access to benefits that protect income and protect their health and well-being. That relates to recommendations around improved safety standards and working conditions. And then we hear that workers want financial institutions to treat gig income as income and to count towards qualifying for things like car loans and mortgages and other financial products and services that can help people get ahead.
Andrew, what do you think? What do you think about those changes?
No, I completely agree with Courtney. I mean, I think the low-hanging fruit from a policy perspective is extending minimum wage protections to gig workers. And I say it's low-hanging fruit because we already have examples from within Canada of provinces doing exactly this. So both BC and Ontario have in the last year and a half enacted minimum wage protections for individuals in the rideshare and delivery sectors. So I believe in BC, they pay 120% of they prorate your payments so that it's at a minimum 120% of the statutory minimum wage based on your active or engaged time, which is, approximately the time between when you accept a job and when you deliver or drop off a customer. So, and in some follow-up research to this report, my research assistant and I, Ashkul Chowdhury, were actually investigating the effects, how effective the BC policy was. And while we're not quite prepared to release our findings just yet, for sure, I can say that it's effective. And it's not obvious that it's effective because some drivers may spend a lot of time not qualifying for these prorated payments, loitering, waiting for a job, time between jobs, that kind of thing. So it's not obvious it would actually work, but we're finding that indeed it does. That it has pretty substantial positive effects it dramatically reduces the share of individuals in those digital sectors earning less than minimum wages. So from my perspective, this is the easy fit. This is the rather straightforward thing for the province to do.
Yeah, that's so important. I'm really looking forward to that research. One of the quotes that stood out to me so kind of vividly in our report was the quote that said, I could be on the app for 4 hours and I would only be made $15. I think that speaks to that kind of time commitment, Courtney, that you were also sharing about. And I guess, Andrew, you spoke a little bit about it, but I think I want to pose this question to both of you as well, from both of your perspectives. After working through this project, where do you both see the need for further research or areas to dive deeper into? Andrew, you spoke about the effectiveness of the policy in British Columbia, but is there anything else that you think we'd really need to dive deeper into from the results of this work that we've done?
Well, just listening to Courtney today, something I hadn't that didn't necessarily come out of my work, but is the access to financial institutions and credit. That's to me, that makes a lot of sense. That would be an important thing, and I can see why that matters a great deal for people in terms of just getting car loans and things like that. Beyond that, I mean, I think I'd like to see more research on how we can extend social insurance mechanisms to include self-employed individuals, to include gig workers. So I think it'd be very difficult to bring these individuals completely into the EI system, but we do have this so-called special EI benefits that include sick leaves and parental leaves and caregiving leaves. And I would like to find out whether or not we could bring gig workers at least into that system, into the workers' compensation system. BC's reforms have also extended some workers' compensation coverage to gig workers. So I mean, I think research on those issues is really important.
Yeah. Courtney, what would you say as, working with workers who are engaged in gig work through your programming? Is there anything that you think, yeah, you know what, we really need to dig more into this?
Yeah, I agree with Andrew. And my colleague Catherine Yee conducted the interviews with gig workers for this project, and my other colleague Tamlin Sturman continues to hear from gig workers. And so we welcome those stories and we welcome what we have still left to learn around lived experiences of gig work and encourage people to connect with us if they have a story to share. And in addition to that, I'm really curious to learn more about what's happening in other places around the world in terms of especially cities and municipalities and their licensing of platform work. I think there's opportunities at a municipal level. I'm really interested to learn more about how provinces and states or orders of government around the world that control labor law, what they're doing to improve outcomes for gig workers. So that's our next learning edge, at least for us at Momentum. I'm really excited to read Andrew's next research report. So yeah, lots still to learn, but it was amazing what we were able to discover and better understand at this stage of the research project as well.
Yeah, I think we're at VCC, we're really looking forward to working with you and through your research, Andrew, too, to kind of further understand the implications of gig work and how that intersects with poverty and poverty reduction. As a kind of a last question to both of you, if you had any kind of final highlight thoughts on just why this work is important and why this research project was important and is still important as we continue to understand the evidence base around gig work. And I'll start with you, Andrew.
So I think there's a lack of knowledge about the gig economy, and the reality is would only expect gig work to grow as sort of digital intermediation of work grows. I mean, there are a lot of advantages for companies to move workers off of their payrolls as employees and have them be independent contractors. And so I don't think this trend towards gig work is going to reverse itself anytime soon. And there's just not that much known, particularly about the effects on, as we've talked about, earnings and the ability to withstand the shocks of daily life, the things that happen to us. And so, from my perspective, just understanding how gig work influences the labor market outcomes of gig workers is an incredibly important thing, and it's a fairly new area of research.
You, Courtney, did you have any thoughts on that?
I'll leave the last words, my last words, to Bajat, another one of our gig workers who shared a story with us. And he said, the last time I worked 5 hours and earned $78. And that doesn't even include the cost of my car insurance, my mileage, my fuel, everything that I had to invest in that work. And so that's recommendations for anyone that can to invest their time in trying to get ahead and find stable full-time employment because it's barely working for him to provide for his family.
Thank you for sharing that story, Courtney. I think that's a fabulous kind of end to really highlight, just at the lived expert level, the importance of understanding gig economy work so that we can work to improve policy and systems so that people can be well and get by and thrive in our economy overall. Thank you both for joining us today on our podcast. And thank you to you, Andrew and Courtney, and the whole team at Momentum for all of your incredible work on this research and this report. I'm so excited to see where we can take it into 2026 and beyond.
Thank you both. I've learned so much from both of you working on this project, and I'm really excited for our work ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this really started me down an interesting path of learning all kinds of things, and I'm very excited about the work ahead too.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Poverty. Let's Talk Poverty is a production of Vibrant Communities Calgary, stewards of the Enough for All poverty reduction strategy in Calgary, Alberta. You can learn more about the Enough for All strategy at enoughforall.ca. While you're there, subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Vibrant Calgary. And if you like this episode, please subscribe to Let's Talk Poverty on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.